popular of the webinars of the season, certainly in terms of interest from the families. This particular webinar will be covering the competitive calendars, and I should make note that it is one of many webinars and presentations and just a piece of the loads of energy we will be putting into building competitive calendars for the athletes in our programs. Um, the reason that we cover off this competitive scheduling and why we feel it's so important is because it's really integral for an athlete and their families to be well prepared in advance and capable of managing their own schedules well in advance of the competitive season. This allows us to avoid common pitfalls that we'll run into on any given year and things that Jeff and I have seen over the years. Things like players missing key events or overloading the schedule to excess or missing key deadlines or documentations for their registrations. The key is for this presentation to identify firstly that the comments we make this evening will be tailored particularly for players with, let's say, 1 to 4 years of experience in competitive golf. Often this would be a player that's aged somewhere between 12 and 16 years. And the reason I make note of that at this point before we begin is I would like to recognize the more mature players who are perhaps gearing to play a bunch in the States or at the national and international levels and so on. And a lot of the content that they'll hear tonight, I guess they've already been through to a degree. Not that hearing it will cause any harm, that's for sure, but I just wanted to forewarn that in the future weeks, and actually in about 3 weeks' time, we'll be running our second webinar, the continuation of this one, which will deal a little bit more with college exposure, U.S. events, and more of the international spectrum. So we could entitle this presentation Step 1 on the Journey to College Golf.
Good evening, guys. Jeff Overholt here. Wanted to quickly speak about and reiterate what John was mentioning around a couple key pitfalls that we often see parents and players going through on this journey of competitive scheduling and playing in events. The first one, as John mentioned, is not necessarily having a plan. So we often see that in a well attempt, players and parents often book too many events. Typically, we see too many as opposed to too few. And we'll be speaking in depth here about what you should be playing in when you do select certain events for your child. And then as a result of it, having to travel in multiple different places, really reacting to what others they may be hearing walking down the fairways at certain events, and then realizing that, oh, there's this another event that my son or daughter should be playing in next week, so let's sign him or her up for that. And then in the process, it becomes again, there's no priority to events, and we often see that there's no plan. So we'll keep coming back to this idea of why we're doing this webinar now at this time of the year is so we have lots and lots of time before we get into actually playing in the competitive season, and it's important to be very, very proactive with this process here. So as you can see, we have got a couple different levels or areas that we're going to cover today. And we're going to start with looking at or getting a better understanding of the hierarchy of events that a junior golfer can play both in the province and abroad. So I want you to imagine that we've got these different tiers or levels of events that a junior golfer can play. And we're going to start to discuss this in terms of different categories. And one of the things or one of the pieces to be aware of when selecting events is that all events are not considered equal. And we'll be discussing this concept of a ladder where your job or your child's job is really to progress to these different levels or categories up the ladder as their age and skill level improve. So I just wanted to discuss what these different levels are of the ladder. So if we were to imagine our category 5, which would be the bottom of our ladder here, we would look at players playing in mostly club and local level events. So that would be events that are at their local club that they spend the majority of their time on, their junior club championship, that type of idea, some local invitationals that might be very, very close to their house. And that would be really the entry point to competition for most junior age golfers. And that could happen anywhere between the age 8, 9 to even up to the age 12 or 13, depending on when the child gets into the sport. Our next category up, we would look at, we'll call this one category 4, and that's where they start to compete in events that are outside of the club level, where they might be traveling a little bit further to certain events. We're going to look at classifying some specific, what we call private tours. And the two big ones that most people would be aware of that would play in would be called the CJGA and the Maple Leaf Junior Tour. So that would be a part of this category 4, and we'd lump the minor events of these private tours in this category, along with regional tour events. So we have a very, very close affiliation and work with the Durham Junior Golf Tour. So they would be an example of a regional level tour that would function in this category 4. And we'd also put in that bucket any sort of provincial qualifiers. So in that rung, that would be where a player is just, again, getting out of that local level, starting to test the waters outside of their region, and that's where they would function. Now, the next rung up would be our category 3 events. This is where we look at those private tours, the CJJ and MJT, they're major events. So there would be 2 to 3 events that would be considered majors, where the Provincial Golf Association and the National Golf Association would provide order of merit to the event. And this is one of the things that helps us to categorize the strength of events, is that Golf Canada and, let's say, the GAO in our case would designate certain events that have a very strong field for one, and typically played on a stronger golf course, and they would consider those majors. Often there would be some qualification that might be needed, even from a what we call a private tour level, where to get to one of the CJGA championship events, you would need to qualify through some of their minor events that I'd spoke about in category 4 there. The other component of category 3 would be a provincial level minor. So we're going to consider that would be, let's say, the GAO's Ontario, the junior match play would be a provincial minor. We'd even classify the Spring Classic as a minor there as well in category 3. So when we enter into category 3, there's going to be this component of qualification that's going to need to happen. Whereas in category 4, really your entry into the event is no more than becoming a member of a tour or the Provincial Golf Association, and then paying your entry fee. But then when you get into category 3, there's going to be some other barriers that we'll speak about to get into the event that we'll talk about at a later time here. Category 2 would be then our starting to get our bigger events, where we're going to classify provincial majors. So that would be the Ontario Junior Boys, the Ontario Junior Girls, the Ontario Bantams, the Ontario Juveniles, or the Summer Games, or national majors, which would be the Canadian Junior Boys or Girls would function in that category. And if you're at that category, you're really one of the top players in the province for your age. Again, deeper levels of qualification will need to occur for this category 2, where they would have had to qualify into a category 3 event and then be very successful in that category 3 event, let's say making the cut at the Spring Classic as an example, or having a top 10 finish. And then this is going to give you some other qualifications in the next level up, let's say. Our top part of the ladder here is going to be our category 1 events. And that's really now when we're getting into players competing at more of an international level, both from a junior standpoint and even potentially getting into some adult age events. And we'll typically look at players working into category 1s really when they're in that upper high school age, and then into college and that, which, as John had mentioned, we are going to be speaking at in a future webinar here. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of the span of events and sort of the hierarchy of different events. And oftentimes we feel that different tours or different organizations will perceive their event to be at a higher rung than often we think. And it's really important for parents and players to get good clarity around the event that I'm playing in. Where does it really sit in terms of its level of importance in regards to this idea of our ladder concept?
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, that before we go and move on to the ladder concept, it might be interesting to kind of stop the train here a little bit and just recognize that the majority of junior-aged athletes in the province are really focused on category 4 and 5. It's there's let alone the barriers to get into category 3, 2, and 1, but in fact the qualification of particular athletes is often not up to par with the category 3, 2, and 1. And so the reality is, for most, in their introduction to competitive calendars, you really need to find a bunch of category 4 events. They're fairly simple to get into. Basically, it's a pay your money and take your chances kind of approach. And if things go well in those category 4 and 5 events, then yes, all the doors will be open into 3s and 2s and 1s eventually. But you can't jump ahead. You have to follow the rungs of the ladder, I guess, is the best way to put it. So when we start to use this analogy of the ladder, the idea being that if, for instance, you were a category 3 or 4 person, then you need to call yourself that and start registering for events that are like that. So the first step, and our help as coaches and our advice today is that for many who are listening today, and many that are in our tutelage and getting coaching from us, you're probably in the category 4 range, which is awesome. And there's a ton and ton of events that you'll be able to play in. So at this point, the key is to sort of call yourself what you are, and then start identifying ways to go above and below. So first off, I'm going to target a bunch of qualifiers for the provincials. I'm going to play in the Durham Junior Tour for the season, and I'm also going to play in a Maple Leaf Tour event that's at my home course. And there you go. You've got your 8, 9, 10 events that you're looking at. But the other thing that you've got to be aware of is that next year, you're very likely going to be a rung higher. And now the category 4 has become a category 3 or even a category 2. And so it's a really smart idea to add into your competitive calendar a heavy emphasis on the category you belong, but also 1 or 2 events where you glimpse where your future self will be. And also a great idea to pop down a rung or two and start to focus a little bit on dominating certain events. So at your particular rung, you may be well suited and occasionally have strokes of brilliance, and you might even win one. But if you can go down a rung back to a level that's a little bit easier, a place you used to play at, and so on, then you can actually start to experience winning and success and so on. Then you play the majority of your events at your rung, and then you also take a glimpse above and try out some of the other events, whether that means going to a qualifier that you know you can't make it in. That's fine. If you are an average of 80, 85 shooter, you know that to qualify for the Spring Classic, you have to shoot 76 or better at said event. It's still a good idea to try it out, because next year, when you do show up and try to qualify officially and you think that you can shoot 76, you'll have that experience to draw from. So our ladder analogy is effectively find where you belong and do the majority of your scheduling that way. But also be sure to glimpse 1 or 2 events above where you belong, and also be sure to glimpse 1 or 2 events below where you belong so that you can continue to experience success and perhaps get some top 3 finishes and things like that. At the end of the day, competitive scheduling is really a balance of all sorts of events. And it's not one-dimensional in its approach. You don't just target one tour and so on and so forth. You're really actually looking to balance out a combination of geography and where you're going to be playing these events and favorite courses and the appropriate level of events and so on and so forth. And to be honest, it's much more of an art than a science. And so at the end of the day, you must identify where you belong. And we just want to give some quick ideas and helpful advice to people who are trying to identify where it is that, or where they really are at. Excuse me. The first point I need to make is that your best ever score is not your average. We will often hear stories of a miraculous 9 holes of maybe a young lady turns the back 9 in 34 strokes. And the loving parents equate that to what should have been a 68, because if 234 would equal 68, and therefore pretty much every day that player should shoot 68. and so on and so forth. But the reality is, of course, that there are exceptional rounds that should not be overvalued in our estimation of our abilities. The reality is just take the last 20 rounds you've done and average them out, and that'll give you a better feel for where exactly you belong and what your average score would be. Another thing to recognize as well as we prepare our players to compete is that competitive rounds are extremely than your home course rounds. So again, that beautiful 9 holes played on the back nine on a Sunday with your parents is a very different experience than a competitive experience. And so if your expectation is to shoot the same scores that you do on your home course without tension, you may be in for an interesting ride here in your early years of competition. Having said that, there are a number of players who play equally well in competition, or some examples of players who play even better when it's competitive. All those are possible, but I just wanted to draw attention to the difference between competitive rounds and home course rounds. And the third piece I would say is that one should always adjust their expectations to appreciate this challenge of competitive golf. Let's not be too harsh if, and we'll hear this story a lot from parents or from players and so on, is, oh, I was shooting 73 all week and all of a sudden I played in the tournament, I shot 87. It's crazy. I must be mental or what have you. But the reality is, this is just part of the competitive experience and part of adjusting to the tension that creeps in when we start to play strokes that matter a little bit more than we would on our home course, where we might have the liberty of taking the occasional mulligan or trying another way and so on and so forth. So the key to recognize is that competitive golf is different than recreational golf.
So if I bring you back to our different categories, we feel it might, to properly determine where your son or daughter might be as a starting point, that magical rung that they can be in the middle of and then work above and below. I just wanted to give you a little better understanding of what sort of skill level we'd be looking at in each of the categories. And as John was mentioning, it's important to be aware that their handicap at their home club is going to be different than what we look at as their competitive handicap. And we would refer to competitive handicap and a competitive scoring average as really the metrics for what we're looking for with competitive players. And if they have aspirations of playing in college, that's really what college coaches are going to be looking for. So as an example, a category 5 player that's just getting into playing in competition, really from a boys standpoint, we'd be looking at a 12 or higher handicap in competition, and from a girls, the 20 and over. In that fourth rung, or our category 4s, now you're looking at a player that's going to be between a competitive handicap of about 4 and 12 from a boys standpoint, and then 12 to 20 from a girls standpoint. When we get to category 3, this is where, now again, these are more the elite players in the province and even the country. You're looking at a competitive scoring average between 0 to 6 for a boy. And from a scoring average, that would mean that their ability to break 75 in competition. From a girl standpoint, you're looking at about a 0 to 12 handicap. And now that female golfer would probably be able to break 80 in competition. The category 2, now you're really looking at a 0 to 2 from a boy standpoint and a 0 to 6 from a girl standpoint. And the category 1, you're going to be a scratch handicap in competition or better if you're playing at an international level. And as you guys will speak about in our next webinar, that's really what we're looking for a player to get to by the time that they are going to be graduating. If they have interest in playing in a Division I U.S. school, they should be around a 0 to 2 handicap in competition is what most coaches are looking for. Now, that depends a little bit on the school and the demographic, but for where most people are looking to go, that would be a good benchmark for where we're going there. So based on that, you can kind of look to see, okay, what is my son or daughter now shooting at their home club? And then probably, as John had mentioned, we're going to sort of make that a little bit higher. So if they are a 10 handicap in their home club, they're probably going to be a 12 to a 13 competitive handicap. In some cases, they are similar, but most of the time, players will shoot 2 to 3 shots higher in competition most of the time, depending on the course and everything everything that goes along with that there. Now, the next piece we wanted to speak a little bit about here was the idea of qualifiers. And I'd mentioned, John and I have been referring to this a little bit. And when you get into starting to look at category 3 events, it's really important to understand what these qualifiers are, because our initial journey for most players in the competitive scheduling will be needing to look at qualifiers and figure out which ones I want to select to get into. So let's take the Ontario Junior Boys as an example of an event that's going to require players to qualify. So with an event like that, the Golf Association of Ontario is going to probably hold somewhere between, in that event, 4 to 6 different qualifying days and sites where players would play a 1-day qualifier or a specific cost. And one of the big pieces that we'll look at with this competitive scheduling is budgeting, because it's an important thing to be aware of, that we're not just playing in all these different events and accumulating these additional costs with travel and that type of idea. But when you're getting into category 3 events, the cost actually becomes cheaper if you end up getting into the event. So for instance, a qualifier for a GAO event is run you somewhere between $95 to $130 in any given year. And that effectively gets the player into the qualifier. From that point, if they do qualify for the event, and really depending on the size of the field, they're going to take a percentage of the field in that qualifier will actually get into the event. So in some larger qualifying sites, that might mean that there's 10 to 15 players getting into the Ontario Junior, or in some smaller ones, it might end up being just 1 or 2 players. From that point, if your son or daughter qualifies, there are no other costs that they are going to incur in terms of the actual event. So now they've qualified for the Ontario Junior Boys. This is going to get them a practice round at the event on the Monday of the competition, plus the first 2 rounds of the competition in the Junior Boys case, where it's a 4-round event. So effectively, you're going to have 3 competitive rounds and a practice round for that initial one-time cost of the qualifier. If they happen to play well and make the cut, now there's going to be an additional 2 other competitive rounds in that capacity. Where when we drop down into that category 2, whereas John mentioned there's really no barriers for entry, and you're really just paying the event, there's a much larger cost that's associated with however many rounds that they're playing. So if your son or daughter's playing a 2-day event, it's going to be much more costly than a 1-day event, and so on and so forth. So it's just really it's important to understand this qualifier concept and how the funding goes to that. Now, understand that when we get into those category 3, 2, and 1 events, most of the time there will be some associated travel with the event, where the Ontario Junior Boys may be in Sudbury. So even though the cost of getting in the event is lesser, you're going to incur some additional costs based on kilometers, mileage, and accommodations that you wouldn't necessarily probably run into when you're in a category 4 or 5 event that's likely much closer to your home location that you could probably stay at your house. So we just want to weigh that a little bit. And the next piece with this qualifier concept is John's going to speak about the idea of figuring out which qualifiers to actually go into, and are there a strategy around selecting which ones, or is it as picking the one that's closest to my house?
So many of us believe that we should be in a category above where we are, and then the golf gods created qualifiers. And basically, the qualifier is the most popular way for people to try to move up the ladder. Typical to golf, which is unique among sports because no one is ever cut from a team, everyone thinks that they belong at said provincial major event, and therefore are willing to take their chances at the qualifiers. And the reason Jeff and I are spending time on the qualifiers, with its own distinct kind of category in our slideshow, is because they are truly a remarkable phenomenon. If you think back, Jeff, over our last 10, 15 years, like it's a really big deal to most new families to kind of get their heads around what these qualifiers mean, and why they're important and so on. And in fairness, they are really the surest way to put yourself on the ladder rung above where you are. And as such, they are extremely popular. For instance, to qualify for the Ontario Junior Boys, there will be hundreds of players competing for, well, less than 100 spots, I guess is the best way to put it. To be honest, at the Ontario Junior Boys, there'll be about 150 in the field. Many of those positions are already exempt, about 50 to 60 of them. So there'll be about 90 spots available, let's say, on any given year. And so then they'll run qualifiers at 10, 12, 13 sites across the province over a couple of weeks. At each of those qualifiers, the top 8 scores, depending again on variables like strength, size of field, and how many qualifiers are being run and so on. But let's say 8 of the field will be actually making it to the championship. And the field could be as large as 100 people. In most cases, to be honest, it's about a tenth that'll make it. So 8 of 80 would make it at any given qualifier and so on. So the odds are not excellent, although, again, very good players have a habit of qualifying easily. And to be honest, extremely good players are usually exempt already and therefore are not at those qualifiers. From my experience over the years, I would suggest that a foundation of a qualifier is to break 80 in order to get into any big event. But again, it could rain, it could snow, it could, lots of variables are going to alter that scoring idea. But basically, a standard entry point to a qualifier would be that at least you would have the potential to break 80, or, as we said earlier, you're simply using the qualifier to play in a big event that you otherwise wouldn't, and just to gain the experience for future years. When selecting a qualifier, again, I've talked to so many families that have seen this as a science, and I think it's a little bit more of an art than a science, and I used that reference earlier as well. For instance, we can overread which course and which location to play the qualifier at. We can have, you can have analytics statisticians go into the fields, determine which scoring averages are coming out of most of the players, and trust me, I've met people who have tried this, and therefore identified which event, i.e., this year the qualifier in Ottawa has the weakest field and the greatest chance for my son or daughter to make it in. All of that stuff, I believe, is overdone. First off, just recognize that other people are doing the same thing. So when you look at the qualifiers that come out next week, and out of the 13 courses that are offered for the Ontario Junior Boys, you pick one because you feel, no one's going to go there. That's got a great chance for us because everyone's not going there. The reality is there's at least 50 people saying the exact same thing and are going to be there. There's just such a high demand for these qualifiers that I would urge you to, rather than choosing on sneaky ways to get in, choose on ways that make this a positive experience for you. So, for instance, a great determinant of which qualifier to play in would be, do you like the golf course? Have you played there before? Those are excellent ones. Proximity to home, the ability to play a practice round or two as a result. Your friends are going to the event, and carpooling will be easier, and it'll be a better experience as well because there's friends there, and so on and so forth. All of those are very, very good reasons to choose a particular qualifier. Having said that, if you're into the science, or at least to a degree some of the science, then you can, in fact, determine how many players will get in at each spot. The GAO makes this information readily available. If it's not on the registration sheet, which it usually is, then you can simply call over to the GAO or send an email and ask them what the quota spots will be. Their response will generally be, it depends on the size of the field, and there's a certain percentage of the size that will get into the larger event. You can look for weaker fields. You can search through the names on a qualifying site that have already registered, and you can avoid, if you see that there's 8, 9, 10 players that you have never beat and never will, well, then you probably won't want to go to that qualifier if the intention is to qualify for the event. Having said that, playing in a field with those people can be a really exciting opportunity, and you may be surprised, and it just all depends on where these qualifiers fit into your competitive schedule building. But primary for me would be, when choosing qualifiers, just work to identify which golf courses and areas of the country you like to be in, and those will give you enough positive energy that I believe that you'd have your greatest chance for success at those qualifiers. Don't overdo the whole thing here. The reality is, choose ones that work into your exam schedule, work into the geography, work into the family planning and around the vacations, and all of those kind of things have to be weighed into this. And we'll show you some documents that do this in the next little while. And so, at the end of the day, when you're choosing which events to play, the reality is you are probably belonging at a certain category, and I would argue the majority of the players that we're working with are at a sort of a category 4 level, where they're going to make a regional tour as a dominant aspect of their schedule. They're going to try to play a few bigger events at the provincial level or national level, and they're also going to maybe play their club championships and so on and so forth at the slightly lower level. And so we have our players kind of recognize their majors, their minors, and their preparatory events. And you kind of fill out your calendar as a result of this. Most players at this age, 12 to 16 years old, should be aiming to play about 10 to 12 events. Some of them multi-day events, some of them single-day events. This is not a daily occurrence to play in a competitive events. Our advice for the young players is get experience in as many ways as you can. See what it's like, see what it's going to be like in your future, and start preparing for the exams you're going to be taking. And the exams, we use that analogy a lot with our players, that competitive golf is a lot like the exams at your school, where you prepare accordingly and you study and you understand what the questions are going to be, and then you go out and try to execute and perform on the day. So as a young age, if you're 11, 12, 13-year-old kind of getting into competition, use competitive scheduling to kind of get as much experience as you can. To the older players, our highest recommendation is to start building your competitive resume, and you, in this case, start looking for scoring average and strength of field. The goal as a competitive golfer as you age is to try to bring your competitive scoring average under 75. This will be a better way to attract attention from colleges and prospective universities and so on. And also, in many cases, these prospective recruiters will also be weighing the strength of the fields that you play in. So playing in that special qualifier in Ottawa that we knew no one was going to be at can actually be looked at as a negative in some levels, because even though you won the event, there was no one in it. And so there's sort of a balancing between trying to lower your scoring average, look for some easy golf courses that you know you can play really, really well at to get the scoring average down. But at the same time, you're also trying to find strong fields that you can go show up in and hopefully have your best day. And there's that sort of gentle balance there for the older players. Lastly, and a lot of the research that Jeff was mentioning earlier in these categories, these are all having to do with what we call the order of merit systems. And again, Jeff and I were brainstorming this earlier in the week as well, and trying to put ourselves in the shoes of these parents who are kind of new to this whole process and don't know the difference between an MJT and a provincial event, or another one that calls itself the International Championship of the Universe, and so on and so forth. And I guess underneath all of this is a governing body in Canada that is trying to guide this development pathway for junior players. And this governing body, let's call it Golf Canada, which is supported by provincial organizations like the GAO and so on, they understand that the goal here is to get to college. They know that every time Jeff and I have asked a young boy or a young girl what they want, the answer is, I want to go play in the States and college and so on and so forth. So the whole system is kind of geared towards that. It's really geared towards their national team or to the college scene. And as you progress through this pathway, they have developed an order of merit, which essentially becomes your keys to getting into different rooms. The highest rooms, the highest level events in the Category 1 events and so on, require you to have earned enough points. And just like the FedEx Cup on the PGA Tour, I hope everyone would be familiar with that kind of system, or just like a money list, to be honest, on the PGA Tour. With every single event you play, there is a certain currency that you redeem. The lower the category events, the Category 5 events, for instance, have very few points available for this massive order of merit. A Category 4 event starts to get a few more 100 points, but by the time you get to Category 3, 2, and 1, you're really talking thousands of points for the winner, and to be honest, for anyone in the top 50. So getting good finishes in high-level events is the surest way to accumulate lots of order of merit points. And when the more points you have, the more events you get invited to. It's a classic sort of chicken and egg where you can't get in until you get the points, but the only way to get the points is when you get in. but that is how the order system, merit system works. And really, to be honest, it requires one breakthrough round that allows you to get a good finish, that allows you to all of a sudden start accumulating these points, and all of a sudden doors start to open and invites start to be accepted, and you start moving up the ladder a little bit quicker. The last piece I would make, and just again putting ourselves in the shoes of parents who may have not done this before, always have a plan B and C, because for instance, if you're trying to qualify for events, just remember that you may not, and in that case, what are you going to do? In many, many cases, luckily, there's a luxury of junior golf events. There's literally thousands that you could register for this summer. There is always an option of plan B and C. So if, although devastated at first, your son or daughter doesn't get into the event that they are desperately trying to qualify for and so on, there will always be other events that you can put on those same days. So building your schedule is really the process of identifying where you are and then picking the majors, the minors, and the preparatory events that are going to make up your schedule. The majors get highlighted on the kitchen, on the fridge in the kitchen, and everyone in the family and everyone supporting, we need to be at our best in this week and this week. Every event cannot be a major. Surrounding the majors, you have minor events, other events that are kind of seen as like test runs or exhibition season, ways of kind of seeing if the game is in good shape. And then we fill out our calendar with what we call preparatory events, and these are easy to get to, more comfortable, less stressful, and ways for just kind of refining the game in preparation again for the minors and then the majors.
The other point to be aware of with the order of merit system is that oftentimes players have goals to be selected to teams that are over and above our golf performance coaches support network. This would be, let's say, a national team or a provincial team, or now we also have regional teams. And you know, John was an ex-provincial coach, and I still spend some time as the head coach for the York regional team. These teams are selected based on order of merits from the Golf Canada Order of Merit, or our national Order of Merit, and then also the provincial Order of Merit. So just to keep in mind, there are multiple pathways to, for most players, get playing college golf somewhere as their short-term goal. But oftentimes they may also aspire to be a part of one of these teams. And just to understand that 90% of the selection of these teams is coming off of order of merits. But rest assured, if you're in that category 1 or 2 and you're playing in events in the US, those are all built in, and they will get points on the order of merit and the national and the provincial. So those are very big pieces as well. When we look at, again, this concept of building the schedule, it's really important to become aware of a little bit of the science. John has been mentioning, I guess, the art side of competitive scheduling, and I'll take a little bit of a scientific approach here and look at the concept of developing athletes and what we call long-term athlete development. So the PGA of Canada and Golf Canada, we've been referencing a couple of these big organizations that run events in Canada for junior boys and girls, and also train coaches, have put together a guide called the Long-Term Player Development Guide that really gives some fantastic recommendations for number of events and those types of pieces for kids in different levels of development based on their chronological age, which would be their actual birth age, and also making reference to what's called their developmental age. And in our previous webinar around physical training, we spoke about this concept of each of the difference between a chronological and a developmental age. Nevertheless, it's, as John had mentioned, we want to start to look at these competitions very similar to taking a test or an exam at school. So if we look at these competitions, especially the majors, as your big exams at the end of the year, it's so important that we allow time to study. And time to study is effectively training in an environment where they're not getting tested. And this is where we feel that some well-intentioned parents start to go off on a bit of a wrong path here, where we get players that are over competing and under training, which means that they're using the competitive environment as their main chance for their player to play golf, as opposed to playing golf in a non-competitive environment at their home club with family members or friends at the club. And why that's so important is that environment where there isn't this competition and all the stresses that go along with it can allow the player, one, to experiment with different things, both from a technical development standpoint or a tactical development standpoint that maybe they wouldn't otherwise try a new shot when they're in the competitive environment. And also it allows them to have practice time. So time away from actually playing golf where they can develop skills, whether it be short game or full swing, depending on oftentimes how they did in their last event. So one of the big pieces of this competitive journey here is hopefully we're giving players this understanding of their game, and self-awareness is such a key piece in learning. Not only this other thing around the scores that they're shooting and outcomes and that type of thing. We're really going to look from a coach's standpoint to draw out learning each of these opportunities. For that to happen, we need time to do things like debriefing and then provide that player some information or feedback based on often what we're seeing when we're observing them in competition and through debriefs what they've discovered to actually work on those things. And that's where when we're planning these calendars in a way where there's optimal rest, recuperation between them is going to be a really, really key concept. And in the science world, what I'm speaking of is the term which is called periodization. And really what it means is that understanding at a given time of a calendar year when we're going to prioritize, first of all, competition. And then in that period where we're competing, we want to prioritize specific events. And that's really what we've been speaking about for the last half an hour or so here is how to figure out which events are going to be our majors and which ones are going to be preparatory events and trying to build in some space in between them. Now, please keep in mind that the way the competitive calendars shake out and where most of the major events happen in both Canada and at the provincial level, and I'm speaking more to a category 3-2 player, is oftentimes they may have to play 2 to 3 weeks in a row. But if that's the case, we want to make sure that there's ample time before that to be able to prepare for the fact that they're going to be in competition 1 week after another and such, and then figure out on those weekend days between them where we're getting concepts and utilizing recovery strategies to help prepare them for the next event. We'll often speak about another term in the science world, which is called tapering. And Olympic athletes that are really peaking for a big event, like let's say the Olympics that happens every 4 years, would use a concept of tapering where they're modifying the amount of volume and intensity of the training. And we'll expose players to this tactic as well. But mainly I would build in that sort of tactic for a category 1 or 2 player, where our category 4 and 5, which most players will be in, at that intro-level stage, don't necessarily need to look at that. So just to understand, there is this art, but also the science behind what we're doing. And I strongly recommend that you guys use as a reference the LTPD guide. It's very accessible. It's online now at the Golf Canada website, and certainly John or I can help guide you in that direction. And it just has some absolutely fantastic information for a little more of the specifics of the volume and intensity of competition. So let's get into the nuts and bolts here we're going to finish with. And John's going to introduce this concept of, okay, now we've got a better idea of when all these events are happening. How can we really make the process individualized? And this is where we're going to conclude here, and where John and I feel very passionately about our roles with this whole process, is helping to individualize the process of competitive scheduling for your son or daughter.
The planning documents that's on the screen now. This is something that all the players in our program will be taking home with them in the next couple of weeks. So I just wanted to present this, and typically it's parents that are listening in on the webinars, and if players are, it's great, obviously, and they can benefit from hearing this as well. But I just wanted to sort of take you through the planning document that we use for competitive scheduling. Jeff and I sort of designed this years and years ago with the provincial teams, and it's been a really successful template that we really haven't had to change much from year to year, and I just wanted to draw attention to it. And obviously, you can see in in this axis on the left that you basically have a chronological a series of rows that players can be filling out from various months. And of course, you can add in a space here if there's going to be more events in April. For instance, if you were traveling out to the West Coast to play the Future Links Pacific and so on and so forth. But in general, April would really be only one or two events. May, June, July, and so on. And so we'd have our players start to brainstorm which events they're going to be playing in. So basically across the kitchen table, you'd have all the schedules, or obviously on your desktop. You'd have all of the competitive schedules that you've been interested in. So you've got the Durham Tour schedule open, you've got the Maple Leaf Tour schedule open, you've got the Provincial Tour open, and the National Tours all open up on your desk. And you're starting to pick out different events that you're going to be plotting in. And one of them goes in July, and then the next one in June. Oh yeah, and it's got a qualifier, and that's up in May, and so on. So as you write the dates and then the event name, and then you're going to also list off which course the event is being played at. And then where this gets most interesting and I find most helpful for the families, of course, that's important because then you're going to see overlap and you're going to see where the big gaps are and so on. Oh boy, we have 3 events in the same week. Well, that's not going to work. And which one do I prioritize? Which is my A? Which is my B? Which is my C? Oh, okay, well, if I'm going to play in that, I better go back and maybe add one here and so on and so forth. But then where it gets really, really interesting, and we've actually seen some fascinating numbers out of all of this stuff. Take note of how many kilometers from home this will be. Take note of whether or not you're going to need a hotel or not. Take note as to whether or not there's a qualifier. This is a very important column. When there's a check mark in this, it better link back to some other event that is the qualifier, because you can't get into an event without qualifying. And if that's the case, then you better make sure that both the qualifier and the event are in. And remember our earlier concern where we said always have a B and a C plan. If you play in the qualifier in May and are unsuccessful, then of course you then have to erase the event in July that you were qualifying for. And when that gets erased, all of a sudden all those other options become reasonable again. And so we need to scuttle back to the event that we withdrew from and add it back into our calendar and so on, all in the interest of periodizing and making sure that we're playing in the weeks that we had determined we were going to play in. As well, we'll make a note of when we're playing the practice rounds, which is an important detail. Obviously, for most getting into Category 4 even, you're going to want to start considering the concept of playing a practice round, very similar to having a practice exam given to you in your biology in grade 9. What a huge benefit it would be to see a practice exam. And so with that same logic, we believe that practice rounds are critical to one's development in the game, let alone they're tons of fun, and it's really fascinating to people who love the game to kind of really explore the concepts of the architecture and the tactics on a golf course and so on. So anyway, practice rounds will get noted in there, and then you write the dates for those. And then an interesting column is just how much this is all going to cost. This is a combination of the hotel you're going to pay for and the 500 kilometers that you're going to need to travel, and the fact that you also had to play a qualifier, and that there's 3 practice rounds you're going to be playing, and by the end of it, you might get some pretty interesting numbers there. So here's an example of a player who has filled out their calendar. This is that same player who went home with the template a couple of weeks later, where they've now been able to fill out all of the events they're doing. You'll see that nice yellow bar across the middle where they've got their school exams are in there. There's a list of a bunch of events. They've got color codes, so they're red events, majors. Their green events are their minors, and then all the rest are kind of preparatory events. Tons and tons of great details in here, and this is a very robust schedule, but not an uncommon schedule for a 15-year-old boy in Ontario who's trying to make it up to the next category. And so you can sort of see how this would have been filled out. I left the money stuff out, but we will speak a little bit to some of the budgeting that should be considered as we go through this. But these documents will be made available to, and obviously the athletes will be busy filling these out. And when I say the athletes, I sometimes, of course, mean the parents as well. And I think that it's important that that the family is involved in this, and that you guys understand, well, first of all, this kilometers and who's going to drive the player to and from and so on, and whether there's hotels and all of this kind of detail. And again, to hopefully avoid the pitfalls that Jeff and I have seen over the years of people who might miss deadlines and miss opportunities. We just want to make sure that this is all done very, very high level and very organized, so that we don't miss a beat.
Part of one of our key skills around the self-management of golf and life would be that we feel that the player should have a really good understanding of what they are playing in, and we've often came across circumstances where the player has knew that tomorrow they're actually going to travel an hour to play in an event, and mom and dad had really just let them know that the day before because mom and dad had put together their competitive calendar, maybe with their coach. But we're going to take a little different process where we're going to start with the player and expose them and get them to understand a lot of the principles that we're speaking to you about today. And then from there, have them present that to the parent, where then you guys can start to look at more of the inner workings of budgeting, which will be a really key piece to understand around this concept of, well, there is the ideal scenario where the long-term athlete development guide, LTPD, would tell you this is how many events that you should play in for your child that is at this age or this skill level. But you need to have an idea of a budget for all of this. And that's why the costing of all these events is really important to look at. So we look at a couple areas where you are going to incur fees. So I mentioned this concept of entry fees. So we need to be aware of, okay, what does it cost to actually get into the event? And these upper levels, category ones and twos, often actually don't cost very much from an entry fee standpoint. But we have these other associated costs here, which would be things like travel, food, and accommodation that we need to really, really be aware of, especially with those category twos and threes and ones where you're traveling a little bit more. These are going to start to add up very, very quickly here. So we'll be able to help you with an idea of, okay, what's reasonable in terms of what we would say the player should be playing in. But keep in mind, it would be great for you guys to start as parents to look at and say, okay, I have X number of dollars. So let's say somewhere in the round of I have $2,000 to spend on my son or daughter's competitive calendar or competitive events this year. And then we need to look at all these associated costs and see how that works in there. But we'd be looking at any sort of a multi-day event, could be anywhere between $500 to $1,000 per actual event, and a local event could be somewhere between $200 to $300, and that's taking into consideration your mileage and gas and the food and all those other things that we just talked about. So we've mentioned this idea, especially when we've got players at this initial to, or entry or intro to competition level, that these regional tours that are close by can help them save costs immensely. And then also when we're looking at qualifiers, to speak to what John was mentioning around the art of selecting a quality spot, we need to take that into consideration, where maybe I can save some money where I don't have to travel to Ottawa to qualify for an event and just do the qualifier that's 5 minutes from my house. So we want to just look at that, and budgeting is a really important thing to keep in mind as we're going through this process and going through this now. So at the end of January, as opposed to in May, where we can not be as reactive, this will really help from a budgeting standpoint. So we're going to tie this off here. John, do you have any other thoughts there before we kind of get
Well,
into
I just had a quick thought, Jeff,
how we
about the
can help
budgeting.
this?
I just had a quick thought about the budgeting, which I found, another interesting aspect of the budgeting is it also has helped to temper people's enthusiasm for competitive golf. Yeah, i.e., most of us at the start of the year, when just putting pen to paper and planning out our year, we basically say, oh, I'll do that and I'll do this and I'll do this. It's almost like our Christmas list we make when we're 6 years old, right? Where we just kind of open up the magazine and just write everything down. But once we start to get a concept of the cost of things, I found that's been a nice natural tempering of that enthusiasm, and we start to realize that, you know what, there's sort of a delicate balance here between what's realistic and what makes sense, and really, what are we trying to accomplish with all of this? And I think that kind of leads well, Jeff, into the overall point, which we may not make in a strong sense through this presentation, but one that you and I live and are consistently reminding our players and families and so on. At the end of the day, we're speaking about a person who plays golf, not a golfer who is a person. And that's a big distinction. At the end of the day here, the identity of this person that we're planning for is not determined entirely by the success they have in competitive golf. And that would really, to be honest, be a very small part of their identity, we would hope. But they love golf. Of course they love golf, and they love competitive golf, and it's important to provide that for them. But the reality is here, let's remember that we're speaking about a person. And this person, really, what we'd like for them, and Jeff, you're a dad, I'm a dad, I mean, what do we really want for them? We just want to give them as many cool experiences as possible. And so let's remember that as we're planning out this competitive calendar and we start to hear other families start talking about order of merit points and how their son got 500 and your son's only got 200 and all of the terrible things that are going to happen because of that and so on and so forth. Let's just remember underneath all of this that at the end of the day, we're playing a game and we're lucky to do it. And it's super fun. And to be honest, as parents, I think we're all just really happy that our kids enjoy it so much. And let's kind of remember that as our ultimate guide here as we build competitive calendars. And in that sense, we want everyone just to remember the big picture here.
Yeah, I'd often have seen at the end of August, players who, as John is mentioning, this experience is probably not what we had hoped for when we'd been planning things out. When the player has just been traveling from the U.S. back and forth in multiple weeks in very, very hot weather, and get to a point where, from the science side, we would call them being burnt out. And that's another side of this experience that we want to ensure that it's always a positive one for them. And competition is no different than what we strive to do every time that we spend any time with players, is making sure that they're going to have a positive coaching experience. We want to have that same positive experience from a competitive standpoint. And this is really where we're going to finish tonight. But we feel very passionately as coaches that we can play a very, very specific role here in helping you guys navigate the competitive landscape in a couple different key ways I just want to touch upon here. So one is, we've talked about in the coming weeks here, we are going to help you and your child essentially walk through this planning process very individually. Time in a group environment where we're going to